So we are live. Welcome everyone who has just joined. We will naturally wait a minute, a couple of seconds for all the attendees to join as they keep flooding in, to make sure nobody misses anything. Here we go. They're coming. Right, let's go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are in the world. First of all, let me introduce myself. So I am Oliver Perry. I'm based in Dublin, Ireland. You can probably tell already that I'm not Irish myself. I moved over here from the UK nearly 1 year ago to work for Trust and Soda. And I also have the pleasure of being our brand ambassador for Women in DevOps here in Ireland. So for anybody who this is their first event, online or offline, the best way for me to introduce Women in DevOps is to introduce a lady called Lauren Langdale. So Lauren is probably in the audience somewhere. I have the pleasure of working with her here at Trust and Soda, and three years ago now, she founded what we now call Women in DevOps, which at the time was an offline community, a non-for-profit community that is designed to help bridge the gender gap, specifically at the time in DevOps, and specifically at the time within the UK. I think if you get to speak to her in the networking after the event, I think it was her and 5 female DevOps engineers sat around a table in a pub all that 3 years ago. Now, 3 years on, we are a global community with Lauren herself now living and working over in America. With 4,000 members, even more followers, all with the same mission, really, to raise awareness of all types of diversity, not just gender diversity, all types of diversity, and not even specifically within DevOps, but now the wider world of technology. So I have the pleasure being the brand ambassador, but this being my first chairing of a webinar. So usually we are an offline community. Typically, pre-pandemic, all our events have been face-to-face events across the globe, America, UK, we've done one in Brazil, and we've obviously had to adapt these to our online webinar discussions, which, to be honest, have added some great value because we've been able as a community to be able to reach more corners of the world. It also creates an inclusive platform for our audience to get involved. So we've seen benefits out of all the turmoil that's going on. This is our 5th webinar in a series of global Women in DevOps panel discussions. All, to be honest, range from sparking discussion within topics of diversity, but also topics of technology. And today, you all, I'm sure, are already aware, this is going to be a more technical focused discussion. Hopefully giving everybody the ability to learn something new. So the title, which you would have already seen, hopefully, is a security-driven mindset in DevOps. Bit of housekeeping, you can expect this to hopefully last around 45 minutes to an hour. We can do live Q&A throughout. So to do that, I'm sure everybody's well accustomed to Zoom. We now have the chat function and the Q&A function. It's really important for us to make this discussion as engaging as possible. So if you have any questions, anybody listening, please feel free to add them to the Q&A or the chat function. I will try my best to facilitate them as we go through, or if not, we'll do a little Q&A session at the end. Worst case scenario, if we do run out of time, we'll do a post-event blog where we will get our lovely panelists to answer some of the unanswered questions, and we'll circulate that through our attendees. Lastly, before we kick things off, last bit of housekeeping, this webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to our Women in DevOps YouTube channel, where you could access this at a later date or our previous webinars. So enough of me. Let's talk about our fabulous panel. So our fabulous panel all over the world. We have England, we have Scotland, we have America, we have South Africa. And on that point, just to make sure everyone's chat function is working, everyone listening in, it'd be a really good time while our panel are introducing themselves, if you'd like to pop in the chat function where you're listening from, what city, what country. It'd be good to understand where our audience are. So I'm going to let the panel introduce themselves to do them their best service. So I'm going to start with the lovely Caroline, if that's okay. If you, Caroline, if you could tell everyone where you are in the world, what you do, and a little bit about yourself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Caroline, and I am a DevSecOps engineer at Intuit. I've been with the company for now 2 years, and I'm in San Francisco, California.
Lovely. Thank you. And Dida?
I feel extremely privileged to be here because I'm not currently working in DevOps, but I've been a cyber risk manager for the last 12 years. And in the last 1.5, 2 years, I have become quite obsessed about how DevOps and DevSecOps works and or should work, because I realized I don't know much about the DevOps environment and how I can do a risk assessment in that area. So I'm so privileged. I'm part of a few communities other than this one, like Ladies of London Hacking Society, CISO Exec, and Open Security Summit, where I have been learning a lot from the people who actually do this job. So I'm so happy to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you here. It's a pleasure to have you here. Catherine, so typically with getting a panel full of technology enthusiasts, we've had a bit of technical issues, and Catherine unfortunately is not on camera, but it was always going to be that way. But hi Catherine, and welcome to the webinar.
Hey, sorry for being somewhat faceless, but I am. Yes, I'm Catherine. I am a DevSecOps engineer working for CloudReach in Edinburgh, Scotland. I've been in the team for a little over 2 years now, and that was my first introduction to DevSecOps. I've always been interested in security and working in network security, so this was quite a big jump for me. I'm looking forward to talking with this great panel.
Lovely, lovely. And Nadeem, I'm not actually sure if you are the furthest, but my geography's terrible, but I presume you're the furthest away in South Africa.
I can't comment because my geography is equal to yours at that point. So hi everyone. Thanks Oliver for the invite and adding me to this panel. I'm from South Africa. I'm Nadeem. I work for a company called Americo. I focus a lot on the DevOps and Agile training, certified training, across South Africa mainly, and I assist organizations in terms of taking them on the journey and coaching them through the process of development operations and getting them aligned from new ways of working.
Lovely, welcome. And last but not least, welcome Aaron.
Hey everyone, I'm Aaron. I am in the United States, in the center of the country. I'm at a company called Trend Micro. I ran a team of DevOps engineers and then integrated security operations architects and engineers onto that team, and I'm now running a product platform for cloud compliance and security at Trend.
Lovely. So as we've been introducing ourselves there, the attendees, we've got Massachusetts, we've got the north of England, Manchester, Reading, Amsterdam, Staffordshire, which is my little hometown in the UK. So I think I've got some friends listening. The Netherlands, Ireland, Dublin, London, San Francisco, etc., etc. Oh, Edinburgh, we've got some fellow Scottish. Lovely. So thank you for all the introduction. Thank you all for the guests for letting me know where you are. Just to really reiterate to all our guests, any questions you have as we go on through this, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A or the chat function. So best place to start. Our title is a security-driven mindset, but with that, the phrase is going to come up a lot, being DevSecOps. So best place to start is if we tackle that as a team and try and create some definition around that. So if I go to you first, Aaron, and if we start with that simple question of what is DevSecOps, let's take it from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously this definition changes from person to person and company to company, but generally it's basically a philosophy or a practice of integrating security into an agile or development or DevOps environment. All of us are familiar with the infinite loop that is development and operations, right? We used to be an iterative and waterfall in very step phased swim lane based development and release of code and building of applications. We moved to this infinite loop of dev operations, but we had security on the outside of this loop. Developers would go and release and do their infinite process from a pipeline standpoint, from a code and deployment standpoint, but not really have security as part of their deployment operation. What DevSecOps is weaving in security into the infinite loop that is DevOps. So having a security overlay or having security as part of each phase in a deployment cycle or in a software development cycle as part of an agile release methodology or as part of your build process is where the SEC comes into DevSecOps, right? It's supposed to be a natural occurrence. It's not supposed to be a bottleneck. It's not supposed to be something that stops, breaks the build, slows down the process, causes headaches, or is even a speed bump. What it's supposed to be is completely integrating security into the development process across the way that your organization or your company releases its software.
Lovely, great start. And what does everybody think of that? Does anybody have anything to add to that?
I think that was almost perfect.
Done, solved. Let's stop the webinar. We've done it.
Yeah, I think if I jump in there, Oliver, quickly.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And I agree with Erin's statement around that as well. It's quite important that when one is thinking about the DevOps journey and DevSecOps, it's important to include it up front, and it goes towards the fundamental principle of shifting left, to enable everything up front before we get into a production environment. Absolutely.
And that phrase shifting left, then if we tackle that first in terms from your perspective, Catherine, in explaining to people who may have heard it before, may not know what it is, what would you describe, Catherine, that shift left approach to be?
Yeah, absolutely. Very similar to what Aaron and Nadeem said. It's essentially a mindset of making sure that security is in every stage of the cloud journey. A lot of the times, traditionally, security comes at the end of a project. So for example, somebody has created this pipeline or somebody has created this program, and then it goes to SecOps to review. That doesn't really work anymore. Yeah, or not at all, that's right. Tech can be very complex and it's growing every single day and it's not standing still. We need to make sure that security is there in every single stage. Like Aaron said earlier, making sure it's not a blocker for progress. Otherwise, people will not report issues and people will not ask questions. So shifting left is essentially just making sure it's there right from the beginning and every person involved is aware of this and gets involved.
Lovely. And is that, if the rest of the panel, is that considered best practice now? Is that considered how DevSecOps is done?
Good question.
It leads me.
In many companies, that's still a dream.
Yeah.
Still, it happens like when you come to the end, new go live, you do a pen test, and that's it. So that is unfortunate, but I do see that is changing, and that shifting left is also enabling that bridge to be built between the DevOps teams and the security, so that it doesn't become a blocker like at the last minute, as Catherine said. And you when you find the vulnerabilities earlier, it's easier to fix them as well. So it's trying to become that enabling function rather than just dictating what needs to be done at the very end.
Absolutely. And from your side, Caroline, being doing a very similar, doing a DevSecOps role right now, what skills and tools and what practical things are you doing, and what would somebody need to be doing to be successful in that space?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I actually joined the DevSecOps space right after college. In college, I was a machine learning background, so I came from a software development. And so when I was trying to decide what I wanted to do after college, I remember talking to my dad about what is security. It sounds cool, but I want to kind of learn more about it. And he told me that it's not about developing something, but it's how to break something. And this new way of thinking for me was really cool because my whole life was always around building the best software and making sure that it works. And now someone's telling me think about how to break it. And so this really got me curious on how can I break things, because this was just so new to me, like my eyes were open. And so I actually did my first hack where I built a brute force algorithm to guess my college's house's Wi-Fi password. And there I was able to see all of their browsing history. And this was really the first time where I really saw how easy it was to hack. And so I think for anyone who's interested in getting in DevSecOps, having a strong foundation of programming is great and software is great and understanding systems, because then you can know how to break it. But almost more importantly, it's really just about being curious to break things and see how to break things. And I think a lot of developers I'm starting to see are interested to break things too.
Sounds like a lot of people could be applicable for that kind of role. I think wanting to break
And
things, but
I'm stronger too.
yeah,
to know how to break it and then write your code better.
Absolutely. And then from the other panelists' perspective, what else would you say is a skill or even a mindset, like the word we use in the title, to be a DevSecOps engineer?
For me, it's more of stop worrying about what you're not and stop worrying about the skills that you don't think you have. I've heard so many things from people who come to me and say, oh, you must be, an elite coder, you must be a great developer, you must have years of experience, and it's not true. It is actually a lot more accessible than people think. You just need to have a really good enthusiasm and, like Caroline said, be interested, be curious, and it's the perfect industry for you.
Absolutely. Good to hear. It's good to hear. And we've had a couple of questions in the Q&A function and in the chat function. So if I go to one that talks about shifting left, Andreas Muller has asked, open question, who anybody who'd like to answer, but how far could you shift security left? So for Andreas, having security scans for all commits hitting the pipeline doesn't work out so well. They're quite slow, up to 30 minutes, and the tools they are using are unable to handle branches and delta checks sufficiently. He would be interested in hearing other people's experiences with that. I don't know if anybody can help.
I have an idea, but of course there's no right or wrong answers here. So I think it goes back to design, or even the idea stage, that where you can do some threat modeling and see what are your threats to this idea, even at that stage. So it doesn't have to be scans related. It can be your cultural, it can be your processes. It really can depend on what you are prepared to do.
Absolutely. And anybody else on that question about their experiences with shifting security left?
To me, that almost sounds like a success problem where developers now are saying we shifted too far left. This is slowing us down. Kind of funny with that, but
Oh, I think I lost you then, Caroline.
what?
Sorry, I think I lost you then. Sorry, I don't know if that was me or the rest of us. I don't think I heard what you said. Sorry.
Oh, weird. No, I love that question that now developers are starting to say how far is too far. I think it's a huge customer success problem, and that the fact that you're asking that is, I think, an awesome question. I want to get that question more.
Now, look,
Yeah.
I do agree with what Tita and Caroline are saying as well. And I think with a couple of clients that I've worked with, often there's a lot of pushback in terms of, why do we need to install security at the beginning? Because as the question stated, it's slow, it takes a while. And it goes down to, how do we design that? How do we get it to a point that it's optimal? And what are the things that we are scanning for, as an example, that take that time? So you look at your branching and merging strategy, you look at what are those type of things that you could add in or remove that wouldn't need security. There's boilerplating that comes out from that as well, which is things that sometimes take long. So I think it's it's a question of how far left do you go, and does it work for the type of business it is, or the type of area that's using it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it leads me well into the next question, actually, Nadine, that we spoke about previously. And the obvious big benefit, I guess, to have a security first mindset in DevOps is being hacked, being exploited, ransomware, etc. What we all hear. But what are the other benefits of having this security first mindset?
I think for me, I mean, if looking at and being around in the industry for a while, having seen that, if you look at one of the DevOps quotes, is that we have transparency and collaboration, across all teams. And if we bring devs or sec, which as Aaron touched base earlier, into that pipeline, we then look at things that make our life easier. So we don't get to the end and we then do a pen test and then we find out we have an issue there, which is too late. And that defeats the purpose of shifting left. Right? It's about creating the culture, creating the visibility and the communication across the teams to show the value that it adds up front. So by the time you get into production or you launch a product, you're secure, and that your code base that's being passed through your different environments are quite stable. So you get, I think, some of the actual opportunities and advantages that you get out of it or doing it earlier, is your having your security teams part of your agile model, your DevOps teams, your squads, if you call it that way. You have, I think, early identification of vulnerabilities in your code, which in some instances and customers that I've worked with, they only pick that up when they're going into production, and that's too late. Now you got to fix and retrofit all the way back into the environments, which is not the case. So, looking at and having the visibility also benefits your customer at the end of the day, because if you release a stable product and a secure product, you have a good customer base.
Very good point. Very good point. And does anybody else have an opinion on the other benefits of having this security first mindset?
Well, like Caroline alluded to, it's definitely best to have security on the mind of every person that's responsible in the process. And that could be from the coders, the people that are doing the development or the application lifecycle management, to the architects, to the project managers, to everyone else, because the further left that you get, the better off that you are. And I mean, guess to go back to that question on, the tool set that's being used, that's adding attacks to the payload for their build cycle. You can try to move or change the way that the tool set does the scanning, depending on how you do or build out your build cycle. But it's definitely a good problem to have, for sure.
Absolutely. And so when we talk about mindset, we talk about culture. When we talk about security first, right? It's not a flick of a switch thing. It's not like an on-off button. It's more cultural than that. There's a question on the Q&A function that some people may have some good and bad experiences with, I don't know, but and Tony asked the question, have any of our panelists had to deal with difficult stakeholders when it comes to implementing a security first mindset from the beginning? And if they have, how would somebody in your shoes, in the role you were doing, overcome these kind of roadblocks? Open to the floor.
Yeah, I can see Caroline nodding there and everybody just unmuted. Absolutely. Especially as DevSecOps is such a new concept. It's just beginning to become a recognized thing in the industry and a recognized mindset. It depends on the type of stakeholder you're talking about, so whether you're talking about a customer with their own responsibilities and their own processes, or whether you're talking about the developers in your company that are working on the code that you're looking after. For me, I found the most success comes down to a few different things. The first one is to make sure you're not patronizing anyone, as obvious as that sounds. I think a lot of the mistakes that I made early on in my career was almost demanding that people do things without realizing I was doing it, and saying, oh, this is important and it's important, so please go and do this. It's more about working with them to understand what their challenges are, because if they're saying they don't want to incorporate this, either they don't have the time, they don't have the awareness, or they don't have the knowledge. I don't think anybody specifically just dislikes the concept. So it's about taking that time to understand their issues and work with them. And I'm sure everybody can touch on this a bit more, but one of the tools that isn't necessarily technical is just using ZenHub. Getting the developers to list out their projects, list out their pipelines, because when they are planning it themselves, this is when we can come in and look at these and say, okay, maybe we should do a code review here, maybe we should integrate this tool here. It's just breaking things down step by step and communicating. And if somebody doesn't want to communicate with you about it, it's about understanding what's important to them and, changing your wording slightly, I think. And, you can always get support from your colleagues and your team or your manager if things are really at a standstill.
Yeah, absolutely. I think communication, the key to everything, right, within technology or not. But Caroline, I know you were nodding your head. I don't know if anybody else has any other war stories, I guess is a good way of putting it, maybe.
Yeah, I think I can jump into that one. Look, I think having been through quite a few of these fights with the larger organizations where they're quite set in the ways of working, which makes it difficult to do a culture change, to do the mindset shift, a tool change. You often get to a point where you map out the whole process and you say, guys, we are ready to to start doing a POC or start showing value in terms of what we're putting down. But you often get that the guys start pushing back and say that, look, we don't see this working because we think we should either do security or do our last bit of testing at the end. And that's how we've always worked. But that's the normal way or the old way of thinking. It's how we need to adapt and how we show value to the team or the people that we helping out. And often what I do is run a few boot camps and start with the top players, with our leadership team, and that's where the bottlenecks are, because if you don't have buy-in from them, the rest of the people in the organization are not going to have buy-in, and they're not going to believe in what you are doing. So if you start off with a boot camp and show the value, and show what you're bringing into the organization and the benefit that you get out of it, using market research, using other areas or other businesses that have done this before, or even to a point where you run a small POC within a small team, like I did with one of my previous companies. So I've gotten a lot of pushback, and what I've done is taken my department and we sort of ran agnostic of the company, and got to a point in 6 months that we were delivering faster. We had more stable code bases. We had a releasable state all the time. And then, that changed the mind shift across the organization, because they've seen the value that we are benefiting from the actual, security process, the DevOps process itself. I think it's coming across and getting to a point of how do we engage with our stakeholders to make them understand the value of security in our chain.
Yeah. And Nadeem, is it right to be honest and say DevSecOps, for example, will have short-term pains with the long-term benefits? Is it something that will always create those short-term pains to begin with before you get it to where you want it to be?
Definitely. I think with any process for that matter, in embedding that process and creating the change, there's always a change management aspect to any culture shift, any process, any tool, aspect that you bring into your organization. So, changing or challenging the status quo will often bring some pain, but the benefits that you reap at the end, overcome that. So you got to ride it out until you get to that point. And that's how I've always seen it, and I've always installed that in a lot of the training that I do. Is build the understanding and get everyone to buy in, and go on the journey with you, rather than build it yourself and get everyone to say now you do, which is the wrong approach.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and one point I will add to that is if you look at the history of Dev and Ops and why they kind of joined together, the goal of Dev and Ops, they both share the same goal of increasing speed for the business, while security is chasing perfection, that 1% perfection. And so a lot of people, when they hear security, they think roadblocks, walls, slow. So I think exactly what he was saying was kind of changing the fact that no, if you integrate security, you can actually move faster, because in the long run, you have better software, which is easier for you to maintain and keep up to date and just better. So eventually move faster.
Yeah, absolutely. It leads nicely on to the next question, actually, because there was question for Catherine, and I was reading up on this earlier, and the first thing that came up, and you said it there, Caroline, was security has the reputation of just saying no. That was the that was the first thing that came up. So the integration of DevSecOps to create something more dynamic, I guess, is the purpose there. But the question, Catherine, is what is the difference between what somebody would class as a traditional security team to what we are now talking about as a DevSecOps team?
Yeah, Caroline covered this perfectly in what she said. Traditionally, SecOps counts for security and operations. It is simply integrating security standard day-to-day sort of IT operations, making sure things are running as smoothly as possible, maybe doing some reviews, doing due diligence. I don't know why I'm trying to say that, because I can't say that combination of words. And making sure we understand about legal and compliance, and making sure things are running smoothly. When DevSecOps as a concept came along, it's development, security, and operations. As Caroline was saying about Dev and Ops, whilst it's not a new concept, DevOps, it's only in the last, I'd say, less than 10 years, it's become a standard part in most tech companies. Same is happening with DevSecOps. DevSecOps is making sure we're in the development stage of the life cycle, whether you're on-prem or whether you're in the cloud, making sure that security is done right from the beginning. Caroline really covered the rest of that perfectly, I think.
Lovely. And also, when I was speaking to someone the other day about this, they mentioned the phrase, and I guess there's new phrases coming out all the time. They mentioned the phrase to me, Sec DevOps. Then, so they'd put the Sec at the front, and then they were telling me about how it's how it then creates a security first rather than a security embedded within. I don't know how that fits into what we're talking about. I don't know if that's a phrase that is used in the industry or is used. If there's a difference between DevSecOps or Sec DevOps. I don't know if that's a thing.
It kind of goes back to the question of how far left can you shift. I guess we have Sec DevOps.
Yeah, absolutely.
It becomes more a philosophical discussion rather than a practical one.
Yeah, absolutely. So
one thing, Oliver, just a thought I had that came into my mind as an answer to the question about the pushback from other teams would be, technically, if you can prove return on investment, right? This might be a discussion for you to be able to show the differences of DevOps with security on the side versus DevOps versus DevSecOps. So if you can show how much money is being wasted or how much inefficiencies are happening over here versus when you weave and integrate security into the DevOps process, I think that's much more beneficial way to prove the value of why you should integrate security, and it quantifies it in a little better way, in that it gives some sort of monies or dollars that are tied to it.
yeah, absolutely. So Nadeem, let's say there's people listening who don't believe they have this mindset, they have this approach. What would you say are the first steps towards implementing that security first mindset?
Look, I think the first step is always to create a standard procedure in terms of understanding, what are my security points in my pipeline or my business area or my business as a whole, and identifying those areas that we need to cover as security standards, creating these policies, creating these procedures, and bedding those down up front. So when you're going forward, you already have a set base to work from. So that if I'm using containers as an example, these are my security sort of protocols, these are the things that I look for, these are my checklists, things that we base it on from that perspective. So there's always different levels of security that we look at, being cloud native, or being physical machine or a virtual machine, depending on what your pipeline can do. So there's tools like SonarQube that I recommend quite a lot, and I use that quite a lot in my daily the daily pipelines that we use across the other companies, and that for us, generates quite a bit of stability across the environments, because it gives you quite accurate reporting. So it's those things that you embed up front. You look at, what do I standardize, and sometimes looking at the tools is not necessarily a thing that you do up front, because you don't generally know which is the best tool for me. So it sort of becomes a trial and error to see what works in my pipeline or my organization. So that becomes a back and forth, until you find the right fit. But going on suggestions and people that have been using this for a while, you sort of piggyback of them and understand, okay, so they've been using it for a while. It seems like a good tool. Let's try it out. And that's how I got into the motion of it. So I think, setting these type of things up front, engaging with the rest of the business, so everyone understands that from a security perspective, these are my steps that we take in order to achieve our outcomes.
Lovely, great analogy. And anybody else, in terms of what would their first steps be? What would they recommend the first steps to be?
Yes, I'm super passionate about this. I always think that in order to actually understand security, you have to put on the adversary mindset. And so the only way to do that is to hack. And, a little bit ago, I actually led a group of women through their first hack, where we used this Raspberry Pi with this software called Panagachi. And what Panagachi does is that it captures Wi-Fi router packets, and it takes advantage of the vulnerability that when you connect to a WPA2 router, there's a moment where the password is open, and then by using this tool, you can capture it, have it on your screen, do some encryption, and then uncover the password. And just by doing this, by kind of empowering anybody, in this session, we had not just developers, we had lawyers, and we had EAs, we had people from all different backgrounds, but just by kind of empowering them with their first hack, they started realizing, wait, this is really easy. I have to change my Wi-Fi password. It's a lot easier than I think it is. And that's the only big way that I see of getting people to really think security first, is actually putting them with the computer, have them do their first hack, and then they will remember that experience forever.
Another idea
It's
that
really,
comes to my mind, just as Caroline explained, it's very similar doing a threat modeling exercise with people from the business. So they start to think with a security mindset. It won't make them security first people, probably, but it will start embedding that thought process of thinking about security and something might go wrong and what can go wrong mindset to them.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny when you put that end user in that position, right? The end user that would never potentially have a naive mindset, putting them in that position to see the potential of what could happen. Then I guess that's when the culture rolls from there. And it leads to something we spoke about when we talk about the phrase DevOps. We talk about the phrase DevSecOps and how, I guess, we don't want them in an ideal world to be mutually exclusive, right? We want one thing to mean both things, right? It should be done that way. So when can we get to a point where it's not DevOps and it's not DevSecOps and it's best practice, if that makes sense?
So as an outsider looking in and researching in this, what I've come to understand is it is more DevSecOps when it is still at a process level. So you're implementing the processes to do security within your DevOps. It becomes DevOps, so you don't have to say security when it becomes the culture. The security culture becomes live and it's like everyone's on everyone's mind to do securely. Then you don't have to call it DevSecOps, but it's now DevOps, and it includes security inside of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm open to be challenged on this. I'm certainly not an authority.
No. Does anybody dare challenge? Does anybody have an opinion on that, on when DevOps becomes DevSecOps, or when they don't have to be mutually exclusive?
Seems like it's evolving. I don't know that it's static or there's a point in time that it kind of happens, and it'd probably be different at every organization, right?
Yeah.
And with every culture.
That's correct. And I think it's a thing of, either do you call it DevSecOps or do you call it DevOps? Overall the process is DevOps, right? And you incorporating security into your DevOps process, pipelines, whatever it is that you're doing from a DevOps perspective. So it comes down to, I think, as Aaron mentioned, it's I think a company perspective. Do you say DevSecOps or do you say DevOps? Personally, I mean, I call it DevOps, and then we refer to a security aspect into the DevOps pipeline, so it's things like that are related to what you would call it in your own organization.
Absolutely. Jonathan Kirby popped in the chat saying he calls it securing DevOps. So yeah, there's another phrase. But Aaron, from your perspective, and when we talk about responsibility, so to implement what we're talking about as a culture, as a mindset, there's responsibility. Whose responsibility is that? And we talk about, is it the security teams to integrate into the DevOps pipeline? Is it an architectural team that's handling it? What's your opinion there on the kind of responsibility within a business?
Yeah, there's such a large strain on the security teams. If you think about the ratio at organizations, and Caroline, this is a question to you, you probably only have a handful of security ops analysts, or architects, but you've got hundreds, if not thousands, of developers, right? and that ratio, I mean, it's tough to manage and maintain. So how can you say with thousands of developers and a handful of architects, it's only the architect's responsibilities? On the flip side, how can you say it's all the developers' responsibilities? Again, I think there's this journey that you have to go down to find the right balance. And the balance comes with people, with process, and then with technologies as well, right? And you have to layer and stack those on. The architects could be responsible for the technologies and the processes, and then everybody's responsible from a people standpoint to ensure that things are taken care of.
Absolutely, absolutely. Does anybody else have a say on that in terms of responsibility within an organization? You answered it,
I think
Aaron.
awareness is definitely important. I think we try to do everything we can to make sure everyone's aware. I think a lot of what we're trying to do now is really automation and trying to think of how can we get security so that they don't necessarily have to have it be all on them, but we kind of give them tools and metrics to use to kind of guide them with security decisions, to kind of make it easier for them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have, what time are we on? We're just past 2:15, so we're good timing. We have a few different questions, a few great questions in the Q&A function that I will open up to the floor. So Ray Gallagher says that we talked about different levels of security. He found that the lack of understanding of these levels to be a hurdle to communication. So he asked, what are our top 3 real security risks that DevOps is realistically expected to handle?
That's a really, really good question, because I completely agree that this is the main hurdle that I face as well. From my experience, and this is going to be different for every single person here, the first one that I would expect a DevOps team to handle, but only if the DevSecOps team or security people have trained them properly, is first of all, make sure that you don't have any secrets in your code. Don't be putting credentials to this. Don't be putting credentials in your code. Make sure that you are not putting any secrets that can compromise any of your applications or infrastructure that you're developing. Second one is to make sure that you are aware that you have to report anything that you can't handle. It's not a level of whether you're technically talented or not to be able to do it. It's just making sure that you get the right support when you need it and quickly. I think the third one is just very similar to the second one. Make sure you ask for support. Make sure you get code reviews when you need them. You don't have to be a security expert. Just make sure you know where to go and to be aware all of the time that what you're creating is very powerful. And you can't risk compromising either your infrastructure or a client's, for example. But again, this is a very high level thought on this, because it is so dynamic and it is so different for every single team and every single person.
Yeah, absolutely. Does anybody else have any other real security risks that spring to mind that DevOps are handling regularly?
Look, I think also if I just jump into that one, there's I think 2 from a DevOps pipeline perspective. If we're talking automation, like Caroline and Catherine touched on as well, is the one being the code quality, the second one being the vulnerability in terms of the actual application. So when you shifting complexity left, from a security perspective, you try and handle all of that up front, before you even move into a staging or QA environment. Why that happens is, and from understanding and personal experience, getting to that point and understanding the actual risks involved, because we get a lot of developers that develop a piece of code and throw it over the wall. And I think that's one of the good principles of DevOps is you actually, you build it, you own it. So you're actually accountable for that piece of code end to end. And so you would build that into the start of your code to make sure that your quality level is at a optimal percentage, depending on what the agreed baseline is across the organization.
Lovely. And then we've had a question from Joseph. So there's a few questions in amongst here about kind of specific tools. So Joseph was in that area asking, how specifically do you systematically incorporate security into the design process? what specific tools and procedures do you use? He mentions he uses, he's put a link to Slack HQ Go SDL, which generates a checklist based on a small list of questions. In practice, it has limited effectiveness. So I probably long-winded that question, but the initial question is, how specifically do you systematically incorporate security into your design process? Does anybody have anything they can help Joseph with there?
So
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Didar.
So from my point of view, and I know I'm not a practitioner in this, but it's not a tooling issue. It's more a process issue, because there are so many tools and even open source tools. If you go to OWASP, the Open Web Application Security Project, there are so many tools you can already use for free and try it out. How would you handle the process around that type of process, process around process? And then you can step by step build, test it out. And as Nadim explained, it might be worth doing a proof of concept with a smaller project first to see what works for you. But Aaron?
Yeah, I agree. It's tough to simply buy a solution and think that the solution is going to solve the problems. It quickly becomes shelfware and it quickly becomes out of practice. Akin to the way that you weave security into the DevOps process, you want to weave a solution into the way that your processes actually work. And when you're testing any solution, you need to ensure that whatever that solution is fits the model of what you're doing. You don't want to come with a solution that upends or is a barrier or just completely out of the way that your organization works. If you do that, you tend to have, what you might be seeing here, which is a situation in which there's low adoption. Nobody wants to be forced to do something that's far outside of the way that they develop, or far outside of the comfort zones or tool sets with which they're familiar. They would like to have something that integrates, that is day to day, and is just simply a part of the way that they do things.
Lovely, thank you very much. So we have a question from Kaylee Ricks. Caroline, I'm going to point it towards you, rightly or wrongly, just because it mentions chaos engineering. So we talk about breaking things, or having that mentality of breaking things. Kaylee asks, what about shifting right with security testing and with chaos engineering, particularly in the era of cloud computing? I don't know what your thoughts on that are.
Sounds like a lot of late nights.
For the benefit of everyone else, chaos engineering, is that something is that a fad at the moment? Is that happening? I don't know if anybody's come across the phrase chaos engineering before.
Yeah, I think for me that if I touch on that, chaos engineering is actually testing in production, as an example. So there's a phrase that says, are you testing in production or are you testing production? So there's 2 points to that. Testing in production could mean you're testing your user functionality, etc. But testing production means you could test the stability of the framework of the production. And I think that's where chaos engineering comes in, is you try and break the actual production system, by taking down some of the servers, bringing up, trying to introduce something new to try and break it. And I think that's where chaos engineering comes in, is trying to show how stable your production is and how resilient it is from that perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, let's try and do a couple of more questions before we move on, before we wrap up. So I've got a practical question here from Michael Pierce, on the theme of making sure people are trained, talking about the responsibility, general security awareness in an organization. He finds that DevOps and software engineering in general have a chance to set that good example. Thinking from a more high-level perspective, does anybody have any ideas, any examples, any exercises that they use or could use to regularly keep the organization engaged, and keep security in mind? Does anybody have any examples of that happening in their companies?
It's not an example, but as I mentioned, the threat modeling, and you can also do CTFs, capture the flag competitions, so that your developers get more interested.
Yes, I agree with what Nidar started at CTS. We used to do Red Team Mondays, which is where people could just do CTFs with us. We have security conferences twice a year where we kind of create our own CTF, and engineers love it.
Yeah, 100% with you guys. We have a couple of different ones that aren't necessarily technically focused as well, because we have a bit of a difficult situation because most of our environments and what we deal with is customer facing. So the last thing we want to do is set all of our engineers on these environments and break everything. We have in our operations team, which consists of cloud engineers and DevOps engineers, we have a security champions group as well that one of my co-workers came up with. We essentially just meet every week, talk about recent security vulnerabilities, talk about what they'd like to learn. We each take a presentation, do one each week, and it really starts to engage people, especially people who aren't too understanding of security but think it's cool and want to get their hands dirty with breaking something. We also, for the wider company, we used to do security vulnerability newsletters. We just round up the security news and send it out, which for completely non-technical people, that was something that was quite interesting for some of them. But that also meant that people, even if they didn't necessarily take it in, were quite aware of what was going on and the kind of things that we needed to keep an eye out for. So yeah, it's definitely a fantastic idea to try and get as many people involved as you can. They don't have to do, hands-on work, but if they're interested or you can spark that interest, that's really, really cool.
Love it. Thanks for the practical answers. So we've got a couple of minutes. I'm going to ask the last question. And Caroline, for you, if you could set us off on this thread really about, I know Aaron mentioned it being an ever-changing landscape and it's not pinned to a point of time, but looking forward now, what does the future of security look like if 2021 and beyond? What are we looking towards now?
Yeah, I think this would actually be an interesting question for all of us to answer because I think we do all come from very different backgrounds. I know for me, I am from a machine learning background, and so I get really excited about all the new models that are starting to emerge in security, such as we're doing a lot of adversary pattern clustering and attack tool identification. I see a lot of companies kind of starting to create tools around that. I think as we get more and more data, I think the goal is really real-time detection and how do we really see an attack as it's coming in and kind of stop it and learn from it and then get ahead from it. So I think the future with machine learning is super exciting. But I would actually love to hear from other people too on this panel and kind of where their mindset is too.
Absolutely. What does the future hold for us, Nadeem? What do you think?
Look, I think it's evolving, and I think Aaron touched base on this earlier as well. It's the process is evolving, and I think security is becoming the forefront of any application design or any design for that matter, be it a web design or a locally hosted. So whatever it is, design security is becoming more of a focus, and I think as we look and as we interact with more people, we see that the question of security is posed a lot more, and taken a lot more serious now than it was a couple of years ago. So I think we are in for a big change in the next couple of years. Where the focus of this is now becoming security driven rather than starting off from a development driven perspective.
Lovely. And does anybody want to add to that before we wrap up?
I'd add automation and to a lesser extent, I know Caroline mentioned machine learning. To a lesser extent, I'd say, quote unquote, automated intelligence or AI, right? Or, that sort of component. But I think machine learning is a much better, much more accurate way to put it. But automation, right? Just getting to the point where you've got playbooks and sequences that are running instead of a human that's doing it with your change control is probably the next most immediate step that's coming to most enterprises.
Lovely. Lovely. Well, thank you. We are 2 minutes late. I'm always running late on these things, but right. First of all, a big thank you to our panelists, everybody who's taken the time to prepare for this and be on here. Thank you ever so much. We've had some great attendance. The chat function is still going wild at the moment. There's some good conversation, and it leads me well to say any questions. First of all, any questions that have gone unanswered. Any questions that have gone unanswered, they will be included in the post-event blog, so don't worry. I've just shared my screen just to show that link. It is also in the chat, which should be easy to find. But as soon as this Zoom finishes, if we all head over to that link there to a new Zoom, we've got our Zoom conferencing room where we can be allocated into smaller networking groups. Panelists will be in there. All the audience, feel free to come in there. We can talk, I guess, more specifically and openly about some things we've learned today. So yeah, everyone should have that link in the chat function there. So yeah, big thank you. Thank you for me, my first ever Women in DevOps webinar. So thank you for everyone's patience. Thank you, panelists. And yeah, keep a lookout for all post-event information, and I will see you all in the networking rooms shortly. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good job,
everyone.
Ollie.
Take care. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Hey, cheers. Bye-bye.
Thank you.